26. As a young man, Varro inherited from his father the money that had come from this sort of business, and it gave him the confidence to hope for a more respectable position in the world. Public life and the courts appealed to him, and by using a noisy rhetoric on behalf of disreputable individuals and causes, and against the property and reputations of decent people, he achieved notoriety with the masses and then civil office. He gained the quaestorship, two aedileships, plebeian and curule, and eventually the praetorship, at which point he presumed to entertain hopes of consulship. With no lack of cunning, he now attempted to exploit the animosity against the dictator to win over the wavering support of the masses, and he alone gained the credit for the passing of the resolution. Whether they were in Rome or in the army, everybody, Fabius's friends and foes alike, took the passing of the bill as a deliberate slap in the face for him. Not so the dictator. He accepted the slight of the people's rage against him with the same dignified composure with which he had borne the slanderous remarks that his enemies made against him before the popular assembly. He was actually on the road when he received the letter from the Senate, informing him of the equal division of the command. But he was quite sure that while there may have been seen an equal sharing of authority, there was no equal sharing of the general's skills. He returned to his army, his spirit broken, neither by his fellow citizens nor by the enemy. 27. Even before this, Minucius' success and his support from the masses had made him quite insufferable. But at this juncture he proceeded to boast impudently and arrogantly that Quintus Fabius had come off second best to him no less than Hannibal had done. Fabius, he said, had been chosen in hard times as sole commander, one who could be a match for Hannibal. But now something historically unparalleled had happened. The superior officer had, by order of the people, been put on the same level as the junior, the dictator on the same level as the master of horse. And this had happened in the same society in which it had been the norm for masters of horse to tremble and shake at the sight of the dictator's rods and axes. So brilliant, said Minucius, had been his own success and valor. He was therefore going to follow his own fortunes, he concluded, if the dictator persisted with the policy of delaying and doing nothing, a policy condemned by gods and men alike. And so, on the day that he first met up with Quintus Fabius, Minucius told him that what needed to be established first was how to put their shared command into effect. The best idea, in his opinion, was for each to have absolute authority and power in turn, either on alternate days or, if longer periods seemed preferable, for equal blocks of time. In this way, he said, each man could hold his own against the enemy numerically as well as tactically, should he have the opportunity for action. Quintus Fabius did not like this at all. Everything would depend on the luck that came his headstrong colleague's way. His imperium had been divided between himself and another, he argued, but had not actually been taken from him. He would therefore never willingly relinquish this discretion in directing the campaign, which he could still retain. He would not, he said, agree to a division by periods or days of command shared with him. He would, however, split the army and would use his own strategy to save what he could, since he was not permitted to save everything. With this, Fabius gained the division of the legions between the two, after the normal practice of the consuls. The first and fourth legions then fell to Minucius, and the second and third to Fabius, and they similarly split equally the cavalry and the auxiliary troops of the allies, and those with Latin status. The master of horse also wanted separate camps. 28. Nothing taking place amongst the enemy escaped the notice of Hannibal, for he had the ample intelligence from deserters as well as information from his spies. Now he had two reasons to be happy. Minucius's recklessness had been set free for him to capitalize on it as he would, and the effectiveness of Fabius's resourceful strategy had been halved. Between the camp of Minucius and that of the Carthaginians was a low hill, and it was clear that whoever took it first would have territorial advantage over his enemy. Hannibal's aim was not to take it without a fight, though that in itself was a worthwhile objective, but to use it to bring on a battle with Minucius, since he was well aware that the Roman would sally forth to stop him. All the land between the two forces looked, at first sight, to be of no use for laying a trap. Not only was there no woodland, but it did not even have a covering of bushes. But for that very reason, it was just the spot for concealing an ambush, for there could be no fear of such a trap in a bare valley, and in fact there were rocky hollows in its ravines, some able to hold 200 men. 5,000 infantry and cavalry were set in these hiding places, distributed according to how many each hollow could conveniently hold. Fearing that the movement of a man carelessly stepping out or the glint of armor might give away the trap in such an open valley, Hannibal distracted the enemy's attention by sending a few men out at dawn to take the hill mentioned above. At the first sight of these men, the Romans scoffed at their paltry numbers, and all demanded for themselves the task of dislodging the enemy and taking the position. Their leader was himself one of the most senseless and reckless of them, calling the men to arms and hurling empty threats at the enemy. He began by sending out his light infantry, and after them, in close formation, he sent the cavalry. Finally, seeing reinforcements also being brought up for the enemy, he marched forward with the legions in battle order. As the battle gained momentum and his men came under pressure, Hannibal also sent a wave after wave of reinforcements, both infantry and cavalry, until he had brought his battle line up to its full complement. The two sides were now locked in all-out combat. It was the Roman light infantry that was driven back, first just as they were advancing from lower ground up the hill taken earlier by the enemy. As they were pushed back, they spread panic amongst the cavalry, who were coming up behind them, and then they fled back to the legionary standards. The heavy infantry line alone remained unwavering in the general public, and it appeared that they would not have been found wanting, had it been a regular and straightforward battle. So great was the courage that their success a few days earlier had inspired in them. But the men who were lying in ambush suddenly rose up, and such was the alarm and terror they produced with their attacks on both flanks and on the rear that none of the Romans had any spirit left for the fight, or any hope of making good his escape. 29. Fabius heard their cries of panic first, and he saw the line thrown into disorder in the distance. Just as I thought, he said to his men, Fortune has overtaken his recklessness, and as quickly as I feared it would, he was made Fabius's equal in command, but he now sees that Hannibal is his superior in valor and fortune. But there will be another time for reproaches and anger. Now carry the standards forward from camp. Let us wrest victory from the enemy and an admission of their error from the fellow citizens. By now, large numbers of Minucius's men had been cut down, and others were looking around for a way to escape. Then, suddenly, Fabius's army appeared, as though sent from heaven to help them. Before coming within javelin range, or getting down to hand-to-hand fighting, Fabius checked his own side's headlong flight, as well as the enemy's furious onslaught. Those who had broken ranks and scattered far and wide came running from all parts to join the new line of battle. Others who had turned and run off in large groups now swung round to face the enemy again. They formed a circle, and at one moment slowed their retreat, and at the next bunched together to stand their ground. By now, that was almost a single line had been formed from the defeated army and the fresh one, and this was advancing on the enemy. But at that moment the Carthaginian commander sounded the retreat. This was Hannibal openly declaring that, while Minucius had been beaten by him, he had been beaten by Fabius. This day of wavering fortunes was mostly done when the two sides returned to camp. Minucius then summoned his men. "Men," he said, "I have often been told that the best man is he who gives helpful advice, that the man who accepts good advice stands next to him, and that the most inadequate man is he who cannot give advice, but cannot accept it from another either. We have been denied the top rank of intellect and ability, so let us grasp the second, the intermediate ranking, and while we learn to command, let us resolve to be guided by a man of good judgment. Let us join our camp with that of Fabius. Let us carry the standards to his head quarters, where I shall address him with the title Father, as his benefit conferred on us and his exalted position requires. You men must salute as patrons those who just now gave you protection with the weapons in their right hands, and if nothing else, this day will at least have brought us credit for showing our gratitude." The signal was given, and the call for breaking camp went up. They set off, and in marching order proceeded to the dictator's encampment, taking the dictator himself and those around him by surprise. The standards were set up before the tribunal, and the master of horse marched forward ahead of the others. He addressed Fabius with the title Father, and his entire army saluted as patrons, those of the dictator's men who were standing around him. "Dictator," said Minucius, "I have just made you equal to my parents in the name I applied to you, the best I can do with language. But to them I owe only my life, whereas to you I owe these men's salvation as well as my own. And so, the decree of the people, onerous to me rather than an honor, I am the first to reject the repeal. I put myself once more under the command and auspices, and restore to you these standards and legions, praying that this might turn out well for you, for me, and for these armies of yours, the rescued one and the rescuer alike. Please forgive us, and give me the order to hold the position of master of horse, and these men to retain their various ranks." Handshakes followed, and at the meeting's end, the soldiers received warm and cordial hospitality from acquaintances and strangers alike, and so a festive day emerged from one that shortly before had been particularly dismal and almost under a curse. Word of the episode reached Rome, where it was corroborated by correspondence not just from the two commanders, but from the rank and file in both armies as well. Everybody now praised Maximus to the skies. His prestige was just as high with Hannibal and the Carthaginian foe, who were now finally realizing that their war was against Romans, and that it was being fought in Italy. For they had over the past 2 years developed such a low opinion of the Roman officers and fighting men that they had found it difficult to believe that the war was with the same people about whom they had heard frightening tales from their fathers. And they say too that Hannibal, when he was returning from the battle, commented that the cloud that usually sat on the mountain tops had now come down as a rainstorm. 31. While this was going on in Italy, the consul Gnaeus Servilius Geminus sailed around the coastline of Sardinia and Corsica with a fleet of 120 ships. They took hostages from both islands and sailed on to Africa. Before landing on the mainland, he laid waste the island of Minix, and then received 10 talents of silver with the inhabitants of Cercina, as the price for not burning and pillaging their land as well. He proceeded to the coast of Africa, where he disembarked his troops. From there, soldiers and ship's crews were led off on plundering expeditions, and they spread out as widely as if their raids were being conducted or inhabited islands. Their lack of caution soon brought them into an ambush. Stragglers were surrounded by bands of natives, men ignorant of the land surrounded by men who knew it, and they were driven back to the ships of ignominious flight, and with heavy casualties. Their lack of caution soon brought them into an ambush. Stragglers were surrounded by bands of natives, men ignorant of the land surrounded by men who knew it, and they were driven back to the ships in ignominious flight and with heavy casualties. Some 1,000 men were lost, including the quaestor Tiberius Sempronius Blasis. The fleet cast off in panic from shores that were swarming with the enemy, and held a course for Sicily. At Lilybaeum, it was transferred to the praetor Titus Otacilius, to be taken back to Rome by Otacilius's legate, Publius Cincius. The consul himself set off on foot through Sicily, crossing then to Italy by the strait, since he and his colleague Marcus Attilius had been sent for in the dispatch from Quintus Fabius. They were to take over the dictator's armies, since Fabius' 6-month imperium had almost expired. Practically, all of the annalistic accounts record Fabius's position as that of dictator for his Hannibalic campaign, and Coelius also recounts that Fabius was the first dictator appointed by the people. However, Coelius and the others have lost sight of the fact that the right to appoint a dictator lay with the one surviving consul, Gnaeus Servilius, at that time far off in Gaul, his province. Panic-stricken after the defeat it had suffered, the state could not brook the delay this would involve, and so restored to the measure of having a provisional dictator appointed by the people. Subsequently, Fabius's achievements and outstanding reputation, together with the additions his descendants made to the inscription on his bust, all made it easy to believe that a man who had been made a provisional dictator had actually been dictator. 32. The consuls Attilius and Geminus Servilis assumed command of the armies of Fabius and Minucius, respectively. They constructed winter quarters early and in complete harmony, spent the rest of the autumn prosecuting the war with Fabius's tactics. When Hannibal went out to forage, they would appear at the appropriate moment at various points, hounding his column and waylaying stragglers. They would not risk an all-out battle, which the enemy was doing all he could to bring on, and Hannibal was reduced to such a state of deprivation that he would have headed back to Gaul, had he not feared that his leaving would be necessarily seen as flight, for he was left with no hope of provisioning his army in those parts if the incoming consuls followed the same tactics for war. The difficulties of winter had now brought the war around Geronium to a halt, and at this time ambassadors from Neapolis came to Rome. They brought into the Senate 40 gold bowls of considerable weight, and made a speech declaring that they were aware that the treasury of the Roman people was being depleted by the war. This war was being fought as much for the cities and farmland of the allies as for the city of Rome, Italy's capital and bastion, and its empire, they said. Accordingly, the people of Neapolis had voted that it was only right for them to assist the Roman people with gold that had been left them by their ancestors for beautifying their temples, and also as a fund to help them in adversity. Had they believed their personal assistance would help, they would have been just as ready to offer that, they said. The Roman senators and people would be doing them a favor, they declared, if they regarded as their own everything the Neapolitans possessed, and if they saw fit to accept a gift whose value lay more in the goodwill of those who gladly gave it than in its intrinsic worth. The ambassadors were formally thanked for the generosity and concern, and only the lightest one of their bowls was accepted. 33. At about this time, a Carthaginian spy who had escaped detection for 2 years was arrested in Rome. He was released after having his hands cut off. 25 slaves were also crucified for conspiring together in the Campus Martius, and the informer in the affair was given his freedom and 20,000 full asses. A delegation was also sent to King Philip of Macedon to demand the surrender of Demetrius of Pharos, who had sought asylum with him after being defeated in war. Another party of delegates was sent to the Ligurians to complain about the assistance they had given the Carthaginians in material and men, and at the same time to get a close look at what was happening amongst the Boii and Insubres. An embassy was also sent to King Pines in Illyria to demand payment of his indemnity, the due date for which had expired, or to take hostages from him if he wanted the date for payment extended. Such was the extent to which the Romans refused to overlook their interest anywhere in the world, even those far away, despite having the burden of this massive war on their backs. Religious concerns also arose over the Temple of Concord that had been promised in a vow 2 years earlier in Gaul during a mutiny of the troops by the praetor Lucius Manlius. The building of the temple had not to that day been put up for contract. Accordingly, duumvirs were appointed expressly for the purpose by the urban praetor Marcus Aemilius. These were Gaius Pupius and Caeso Quinctius Flaminius, and they contracted out the building of the temple on the citadel. A letter from the same praetor, Manlius, was sent to the consuls on the authorization of the Senate, requesting one of them, if they saw fit, to return to Rome to arrange the consular elections. Manlius added that he would announce the election for the date they ordained. The answer that came back from the consuls was that they could not leave the enemy without prejudice to the state, and so it was preferable for the elections to be held by an interrex than for one of the consuls to be called away from the war. The senators felt that it was more appropriate for a dictator to be appointed by one of the consuls to hold the elections. Lucius Venturius Philo was appointed, and he in turn appointed Marcus Pomponius Matho to be his master of horse. But there was an irregularity in the appointment process, and they were ordered to resign their posts after 14 days. The state then returned to an interregnum.